Let's pause for Thank you, Lord, for gathering us together tonight, today, this morning. Thank you for binding us, bring us together in our values and our beliefs. Bless our speaker tonight. Bless all of us who are here. May you guide us with the Holy Spirit so that true dialogue will happen this evening and that we will be inspired to share what we learned tonight with others so that we will make a contribution towards change, towards eradicating racism, not just among Filipinos, but around the world. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So I will give the floor now to Richard Chu, Dr. Richard Chu, to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Um, Good evening, everyone, or good morning, as the case may be. I'm really honored to give the introduction or introduce our distinguished speaker for today. I was asked to do so because Tony Lavinia and I were roommates when I was in college, and I think he was already teaching philosophy. We were at the House of Being along Katipunan Road, where, if you know, Dean Leo Garcia was the one who started the the House of Being. And so it's called House of Being because most of those who lived there were either philosophy faculty or students. And at one point, there were 13 of us in 3 rooms with 1 bathroom. So those were really very good memories. So Dean Tony Lavinia graduated from Ateneo with a Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy and took up law at UP Diliman. And then he later on got his Master's of Laws at Yale Law School. And he has been a teacher for nearly 40 years, first serving as a philosophy teacher at Xavier University in Cagayan de Oro when he was a Jesuit volunteer. And this was followed by philosophy teaching stints in Ateneo, Mother of Life, and Holy Apostle Seminary. And for 10 years, he was a full-time professor at the UP College of Law. And he also lectured in several universities abroad, including Harvard, Yale University, Johns Hopkins, and University of Denver. So Dean Tony was previously Executive Director of Manila Observatory, Dean of the Ateneo School of Government, Senior Fellow and Biological Resources Program Director at the World Resources Institute, Undersecretary of the Philippines Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and co-founder of the Research and Policy Development section. He was co-founder of the Legal Rights and Natural Resources Center. Currently, he is senior fellow on climate change and energy, and energy collaboratory director of Manila Observatory. Dean Tony is also well known, in fact, for his climate change and environmental expertise and his longtime advocacy of human rights, indigenous peoples' rights, good governance practices, and social entrepreneurship. So we cannot have a much better speaker for tonight's topic than Dean Tony Lavinia. Welcome and thank you.
myself. Hello, can you hear me now? Yeah, I'm okay. Can I share the screen? Um, so there it is. Okay. Um, First, let me um, just say where I'm coming from on this topic. I in terms of my experience in the Philippines, from the very beginning as a lawyer, um, together with a few friends from UP Law, we decided to um, be lawyers for indigenous peoples, for the most marginalized group of Filipinos. No? So from the very beginning, even as lawyers, we experience very direct hand how fellow Filipinos look down on the most marginalized, different in culture, sometimes different in race, as you know. So that's one part from where I'm coming from. I also come from an experience of cumulatively 10 years of living in the United States. 3 years in New Haven, Connecticut in the 1990s, when it was very when race issues was at the center of a lot of things. I mean, every day when we were living in the U.S., I was with my family then. I would hear gunshots from my safe Yale apartment, but just a couple of kilometers away was an inner city, mostly of African Americans, and every night you could hear gunshots. And you could never, we were told anyway, never to go to these places and stay in those places after 5 p.m. It's changed a lot after 20, that was 20 years ago. It's changed a lot after that, but I had a very visceral experience of racism. And of course, those of you who were already in New York City in the early 90s, at the time, Mayor Dinkins was the mayor of Quezon City, who was an African American. Also, race issues were a big thing in New York City. And then I came back to the Philippines for a couple of years to join government and work there. But I went back to the US in 1999 and stayed there for another 9 years until 2000, or 8 years until 2006 before going back to the Philippines in Washington, D.C. And so you can imagine also my experience of race issues. So I come with that background, thinking a lot about these things all these years, both in the Philippines and in the US. Then I came back to the Philippines, went back to Ateneo, actually, de Manila, to teach and to also be the dean of the School of Government. And just the last year, I have gone back to teach philosophy again. I see your different generations. I probably have taught some of you. Certainly, I remember Richard. Richard's a good friend. I remember him when he was very, very young. He was the youngest. He was the baby of our group. And it was very good to have long conversations with Richard in those days when actually this was during the Aquino assassination and all those changes that were happening in the Philippines then. And I was a philosophy teacher, but detoured to teach law and to do law for a long time, 30 years. And then after 30 years, just last year, I went back to teaching philosophy, my first love. So when I was asked to do this talk, I actually thought it was a panel and said, okay, yeah, sure. And then I realized it was the main speaker, so I had to prepare more than I thought I needed to do. No? So the first thing I like to do is to frame the issue properly for us. I mean, and I thought that one way of doing this, I've heard many Filipinos, even then, even before Black Lives Matter has been right now the polling says huge majority of Americans now support Black Lives Matters, but that was not the case a year ago. That was not the case certainly 2 or 3 years ago, even among some of my friends and my relatives. And you still hear that today, right? I mean, eh, parang if you say Black Lives Matter, it's in contradiction to what should be the better position, which is that all lives matter, which of course is true, right? But by saying that, we often, I mean, the people that I talk to often then really mean that Black lives doesn't matter really because all lives matter, right? It's that kind of dynamism. Oh, if all lives matter, then your issue is just one of the thousands of issues that we have to deal with. And so I'd like to do some philosophical reflection on that. I mean, all of you went through philosophy in Ateneo, and so your basic, right? Your basic Greek philosophy, Plato versus Aristotle. If you follow Plato, then all lives matter is the right construct, di ba? Kasi for Plato, your body doesn't matter, your race doesn't matter, your sexuality doesn't matter, your gender orientation doesn't matter, your being a Filipino doesn't matter. Because for Plato, there's a separation of body and soul, and what matters, or later on to spirituality, when Christians took on Platonic thought. But even then, Plato was contradicted by his most famous student, Aristotle, who actually said, no, the body is just as important. The empirical is just as important as the idea. But for those of you who studied philosophy in Ateneo, you would remember your philosophy of man, right? With Heidegger and Marcel, and I'll go to that in a while. I'll talk about Heidegger, Marcel, Levinas, and then I'll go to the Philippine historical experience of racism, our colonial history, and then internal racism in the Philippines. Richard would know certainly the racism faced by Chinese Filipinos. And then I'll end with Philippine experience of racism in America, based also on my own experience, but also using the words and the works of Carlos Bulosan. And then at the end, I will go back to the initial issue of Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. So as I said, the implicit argument that underlie all lives matter is the lives of all human beings have worth and should be respected, and to give special attention to Black people, as in Black Lives Matter, is to negate the fact that all lives matter. So my question is, are we racist if we deny that there is systematic racism in the world? Because, when you say all lives matter, you can deny that, and you can say, well, ganyan ang buhay eh. Diba? People are oppress each other and hurt each other. It's not racism, it's just normal. It's like, that's what you hear from many of the people in the Trump administration, that there's no systemic racism in the police, no systemic racism in America. On the other hand, are we racist if we argue that an acknowledgement that people of color, particularly Black Americans, are discriminated upon, because then we are focusing only on one group to protect or to recognize at the expense of other groups? So how do we make sense of this debate? I mean, so I talked about Plato's dichotomy of body and soul and Aristotle's contradiction of that. But let's go to more contemporary philosophy. All of you would have heard these names and learned these insights or these concepts in Ateneo. Heidegger, di ba? We are Dasein, we are their beings. We are in the world as their beings. And we come with what? And we saw that again, Gabriel Marcel takes on that insight as saying we are embodied spirits coming from Aristotle, with what you would remember these terms, facticity and historicity. We come with nationality, religion, sexuality, gender orientation, and race actually is the most immediate of that, because in most instances, I think there are people or present themselves in a way that their race might be hidden or confusing, but most of the time it's easy to determine race. While others, you religion, well, only if you dress the part, right? Like if you're a Muslim or an Orthodox Jew. Nationality, you're never sure. We Filipinos were always told we were Chinese or we're Japanese. Sexuality, gender orientation, all of that. There needs to be a conversation. But sometimes race, we don't even have to have a conversation. We make that judgment already right away. So we cannot separate ourselves from that. I mean, and so because of that, racism happens because we cannot separate ourselves from our race, and we cannot separate ourselves from seeing people from their race. Racism happens. Emmanuel Levinas, another philosopher that you would have learned, especially those who started studying in the 80s and the 90s. In my time, we were more Gabriel, Marcel, and Heidegger, but Levinas became someone that was taught in Ateneo in the 1990s. Levinas talks about the natural attitude of human beings, which is what of one Jozan's enjoyment, assimilation. We see everything in relation to ourselves, how they fit into our predetermined categories, everything, our food, our ways of doing things. And so we have an allergy of the stranger. We have an allergy of anything that disrupts us. And when we meet people that we do not know and whose race we're not familiar with, it's natural for us. The natural attitude is actually to deny the other or to assimilate the other. If we're good people, we don't deny, right? But we try to assimilate. We try to understand from our perspective and make us the same as us. But Levinas stresses the importance of the face, the epiphany of the face. The moral experience, he says, begins with the epiphany of the face, the moment when we encounter the other, and the other is no longer, based on us, based on what we think, on how we perceive the other, but the other as other, for which we have responsibility. And so racism is overcome when you see that the other is not you, and the other as not you is beautiful, is infinite, is something you can embrace precisely because it is not you. And race is one of those things that separate us from each other, but also if we recognize that, can actually help us recognize the face in the other. So going back to Black Lives Matter, now returning to Levinas, to recognize our infinite responsibility to each other, really means also that if you see that the other is oppressed, you will object to that. You will fight that. You will see that you're also oppressed if the other is oppressed. So when you say all lives matter, in a way that you negate Black Lives Matter, you're actually accepting that oppression, including your own oppression, right? Because as we go, of course, we also have our own experience of being racist and being also a target of racism. Of course, Black Americans, African Americans have a particular history, because of slavery. Let's be very face it that the ancestors did not come to America by choice, and the circumstances with which they were brought to America, that they lived in America for hundreds of years before. The things that they had to go through and the things they still have to go through up to today, leading to the death of George Floyd, is something unique to African Americans, that we experience racism in all forms, including us Asians and Filipinos, but I don't think at the extent of which we experienced. I do remember when I went to Yale, and my classmates, I had African classmates, not African Americans, African classmates who were elite, right? Elite because this is Yale Law School. This was a master's and a doctorate in Yale Law School. They were the elite of Africa. Of Kenya and Zambia and other places. And I remember they told me how difficult it was to adjust to the fact that when they enter any place, any place, that they would be looked at right away as suspects, as people who would shoplift, as people who were in drugs. I mean, no matter how they dress and no matter how they look. That was actually my first direct experience of the U.S. No, that experience of seeing my classmates from Africa dehumanized. I mean, just because of the color of the skin, nothing to do with their behavior at all. I mean, they're the most formal people you can ever find. And yet, in New Haven, Connecticut, bastion of liberalism, right? In all the surrounding stores and in many of the restaurants run by usually Italians, Italian Americans, or white Americans, they were looked at with suspicion. But as I said, this is also true for the Philippines, and we forget that when we become racist ourselves. Now, when we go to America, we can become racist, and I too can have to say that there have been moments in those 10 years I lived there that I have this construct, and I forget that we were treated in a very racist way by our colonial masters, no? by the Spain, Indios. Remember, just read Noli and Fili, and you can read it as a tract about racism. Color of the skin is what determined hierarchy in Spanish colonial, even among Filipinos, right? And of course, when the Americans came in, I have a quotation there from my colleague from the philosophy department, Professor Rowie Azada Palacios, on how the American, and Richard will be very familiar with this, how the Americans came and gave us all sorts of constructs, even among ourselves, to divide ourselves between savages, for example, and Christians, to the use, very important, is very important, the use of and the piloting in the Philippines. Because remember, the Philippines was the only colony of the United States, right? And before Vietnam, it was the only place where they could actually, on a large scale, do law enforcement and do military operations outside America. And so all these brutal police tactics, these military tactics, later on in Vietnam, and even now that you see, in the streets of America, these were all, many of the spirit behind it were all used in the Philippines first to subjugate the Philippines during the Philippine-American War. If you remember, a lot of that history has been lost, but it is a real history of human rights violations, and that was racist, because they would never do that to Europeans. They would never do that to fellow white Americans, right? But Filipinos, they're not human. So let's do this. Let's try all of these different ways of enforcing their conception of the law. Going back to that point of Rowie, the white man's burden became us, and unfortunately, even after independence, our elite took on also that approach, and up to now we divide Filipinos in according to ethnicity, even according to race. Certainly the ATAs are going to be in the bottom of that, and that's because of their color. And of course, we have also all our racist tendencies. I won't talk about that too much with Chinese Filipinos, with Indian Filipinos, with Black Americans that actually come to the US. See how they're treated versus how we treat white Americans and white Europeans. No? I could never understand why we were not. I don't see a lot of racism against Japanese and Koreans, and I don't know if that's an economic construct or something, and I never really have thought about that. But let me go back now and end with racism in the United States and the Philippine experience of racism in the United States. We also forget, because I guess suppose many of you are second first or second generation Americans, right, or immigrants in the last 20, 30 years. So it's not your experience, but always remember that the first Filipinos, or among the first Filipinos that went to immigrated Americans were laborers in the plantations in Hawaii, in California, in Washington State. I mean, and this very interesting um, text from or quotation from Americas in the Heart by Carlos Bulosan is one of those early migrants. I mean, and when he came to America by train, he was told, going to California, it's the beginning of your life in America. All roads go to California and all travel to Los Angeles, but not these travels. Julio said, the other car. I know that state too damn well. What do you mean? Suddenly he became sad and said, "It is hard to be a Filipino. It's hard." Sorry, I couldn't see the PowerPoint. How do I minimize this one? Let me see. Just a minute. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. There. It is hard to be a Filipino in California. You won't say that now, right? I mean, I've been to California, I have relatives in California, best friends in California, and a son, in fact, in California. And you probably won't say this now. It's hard to be a Filipino in California. But at the turn of the century, it was hard to be a Filipino in California. And we forget that. And we should remember that when if you have a tendency to say that, well, racism is like that and we just have to live with that, I mean, because once it was hard to be Filipino in America. I end always when I talk about racism in America, and I talk about how Carlos Bulosan sort of understood that and understood that racism was a universal thing. I mean, and I usually quote from America in the heart with that. I mean, and I'd encourage you to do that. I mean, and if it's true that America is in the heart, right? Then we cannot be racist, whether in America or in the Philippines or anywhere else in the world where there's there seems to be, I hope it will reach a logical conclusion. There seems to be a universal now acknowledgement that racism is wrong in all forms. So when you say Black Lives Matter and you fight for Black Lives Matter, that's also actually saying all lives matter. But at this moment, in this time, this is the most important thing, because if we win Black Lives Matter, we win with all lives matter. Thank you. Hello?
Hello, thank you so much, Tony, Dean Tony. And so open the floor for questions addressed to Tony, or if someone else can add on to what he said, then you're welcome. So those of you who would like to ask a question, unmute yourself and then ask it, please.
Richard. Richard, nakamute ka.
Thank you, Tony, for that very enlightening lecture. I really miss the philosophy classes in Ateneo. This is more of just a parang pragmatic question. How is the United States perceived in the Philippines today by Filipinos in terms of the Black Lives Matter, the anti-Black racism going on? What's the sentiment back there?
I think in the Philippines, I suppose we don't have any polling yet, but we'll actually make sure we get that that polling. No? But as you know, the Philippines among the countries in the world is one of the most where huge majorities like America, like the U.S. I mean, and so this actually comes a surprise to them. I mean, in many conversations that I have with people, they sort of are surprised that it can be that bad, especially after seeing, I mean, the very big thing, seeing the 8-minute video of George Floyd. So I think attitudes are also changing because of that. But that would have to be determined by polling in the future, and whether they change their minds about America and understand the extent of racism in the U.S. But certainly among us teachers, even lawyers, this quotation I have from Professor Rowe is shared by many. You know, I mean, the knee-jerk kasi of Filipinos is we don't have the problem of race, right? Because it's a colonial construct of a mixed race. I mean, so there's a denial that we are
racist.
Racist. I mean, and so this is to be able to say that we're able to say, I think now, seeing what's happening in America and the systemic racism so much in front of us, we also see, some of us are seeing that also in us. I mean, in ourselves. And as you know, there's very big challenge that we have with Chinese Filipinos because of the political context of China, the country, versus Chinese, the people, and Chinese Filipinos who are of Chinese origin, right? People confuse that and conflate that a lot. I mean, so this is actually a good chance to call everyone on that, right? That this is what we're talking about, which is that you are totalizing, you are using Levinas or Plato, using Levinas in particular, you are treating the other not as other, but according to how you think. So it's something we will for sure be looking at a lot in our philosophy classes. By the way, the other aspect of racism that I would have wanted to share with you for a longer time was the experience of Filipino OFWs, no? So of OFWs, overseas Filipinos, not in America, because that's a unique experience, but in Europe and in the Middle East. As I teach a lot, I have lots of students taught of a lot of courses. It's leadership courses, so it's about the essence of their experience. I mean, and they have again and again shared with me the difficulty that they have, and the construct there is also race. I mean, and that is something we should also acknowledge and recognize.
Hello, Dean Tony.
Hello.
So this is Michael. I just have a quick question about what Professor Palacios. She was actually my philo professor back in
Oh,
college.
good. She's in India
So
now.
oh, I understand. Yeah, that was
Doing a
like
PhD. Yeah.
7 years ago, 6 years ago. So I just had a question because you mentioned the literature on the white man's burden and how the history is lost with how the Americans use the law enforcement that they're using now. That you mentioned that those human rights violations were first done in the Philippines. Can you just give us like information or literature so we can follow up on that? Because I haven't read anything about that. That the
No, good.
first.
Yeah, there's a good article actually by Julian Go. I don't know if you're familiar with him. I think it's also in Massachusetts. Let me look at that. Um, that's specifically talks about that. I mean, so let me give you the at least the complete name. It's easy to Google actually. But okay, just a minute. Sorry. Here, Julian Go, Boston University. The Imperial Origins of American Policing, Militarization and Imperial Feedback in the 20th Century. Let me share that with so you can see, all of you can see that. There, Julian Go, Boston University. These are my notes. I mean,
Okay, thank
Imperial
you.
Origins of American Policing, and so it's really fascinating.
It is.
Although we've already on the military side, we know that because Hamleting, which was done extensively in Vietnam, was first tried in Samar. I mean, when they would tell all the villagers to get out of the villages and go to the center, so then they could kill everyone that's there. And I mean, so but even American policing, weapons, right? I would have famous story of the 45, the gun. They had to develop it to fight the Muslims who would go hurumantado as they call it, and they did not know how to deal with that. Okay, let me just go back to stop share. Okay.
So, Dean Tony, there's a question here. With our perceived Pinoy culture of subservience, how do you think we can put forward a fair agenda on racism?
I guess it depends where, right? I mean, but I suppose in the U.S. there's a lot of work to be done. Quite frankly, I will not leave myself out of that because there's been not too many moments, but there have been moments that I would say, I mean, just seeing someone, I commuted in Washington D.C. a lot, right? So sometimes late at night, and and sometimes you'd see someone, and really, when you reflect on it, that person's not doing anything any different, but just because of the color of the skin and the size of the person, very big persons like George Floyd was, I would be afraid. I mean, but I think we can be very frank and honest that many of our friends, our relatives are racist, and would actually justify that even today, right? Because they're really like that. They really are, even when, and I guess, how do you conquer that, right? You conquer that actually by reaching out individually and as groups. Maybe it's safer to do it as groups, as fair to reach out and to actually appreciate that. In our case, because churches are the best places to do that, quite honestly. We were lucky because when we were in Washington, D.C., we actually we actually stayed in, not worship in an African American church in Anacostia, which is really inner city of Washington, Washington D.C. I mean, and it's something we really appreciated. For 8 years, we went to church in a black neighborhood. I mean, in Anacostia, where at first everyone told me, "Don't go there because you'll be mugged," But it took me 6 years. But by the 6th year, even late at night, I would, walk around already with friends in the neighborhood and knock on doors with people, etc. Um, but uh, but it's wonderful. I mean, the best churches in the world, some of the best churches in the U.S. and in the world are African American churches. No? Um, it's fun. The music is good. The preaching is good. The people are all engaged. I mean, we saw that in the funeral of George Floyd. I mean, so, but you have to really conquer your fears and reach out for that. And so for me, in the U.S., for Philippines, that is an important thing to do, to educate each other, and that's why I agreed to do this. I mean, in the hope that it can also help you. And then, of course, in the Philippines, there's lots of work to be done. I mean, also for the different groups that we discriminate upon, especially the more marginalized groups that do not have means to defend themselves from racist or ethnic attacks.
So, Tony, there's another question from Grace. Mary Grace, can you ask your question now?
Yeah. Hi, Dean Tony. Thank you so
Okay.
much. I'm class 76 in Loyola, the first women when graduates from Ateneo, and I really enjoyed my 20 units of philosophy with Ed Calasanz
Ayun.
and Dr. Reyes. I don't know if you remember them.
No, Ed is still there, but now based in France.
I know
But
we
the
lost
Levinas
Joey.
lecture,
Yeah.
the Levinas lecture, the Levinas part of the lecture is actually from an article of Ed Calasanz.
Okay. Anyway, I've lived here in the States for 25 years now, and I'm very active in the unions and with African American communities. How can we, because it's not only racism from our communities, it's also our judgmental thinking and behavior towards religion. Like if you're not Catholic, second is sexuality is a big issue, mental health and all of these things. So how can we educate our community, not just in the US, but in the Philippines, because of course there's still a big influence on both sides of the ocean, that how we can open up more and to be less judgmental. Because I believe, being a ex-Catholic, I'm now 45 years SGI Buddhist, but we do a lot of interfaith with, with Dean Carter, with, the Christian movement and, all the different religions. I just find that this is a difficulty that our community, and so it's so hard for us, to integrate really, I mean, from the soul to being American. We gather together in churches. That's where you'll find the Filipinos. They're active either in the churches or they're, what do you call this? They're like this, Ateneo, our groups, or our provinces coming from the Philippines, but to really integrate as an American, which is very important, especially for our, next generation of children, to come out, even politically, even, this has been my struggle, so that we can advocate and engage and have a greater voice, knowing how to dialogue, being an American, not just Filipino. So I hope this dialogue is being recorded, because I'd really like to share it with my other Filipino groups, because it's really very critical what you've shared with us. And in fact, I only learned about the million Filipinos during the Filipino-American War from my daughter. We erase it from our history that they were all, including Andres Bonifacio, all our revolutionary leaders were disseminated. And we don't have that history. My daughter was the one who shared, because she was a Fulbright scholar. She started sharing it with me, and I think it's in the People's History of the US, where maybe you can find some of those historical facts. We need to know that, because then we can also take out the colonial attachments that we have, because we were definitely disseminated, and that's why we have such a struggle to unite as a people, So anyway, I'd like to get your input, because it would really help, I think, us here. And I'm so glad Jojo put this group together so that we can engage in America as also Filipino Americans. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for that question. And it was a question I really struggled with also when I was in Washington, D.C. and active in the Filipino community and looking for an opening to do that. And so we actually have that opening now with Black Lives Matter. I mean, because lots of things are now being questioned. I mean, and all the communities of the polling so far has been really quite amazing. I mean, that people are willing to question long-held assumptions. The first step is actually to conquer fear and to help people conquer fear. I really believe that, most of us are not ingrained racist, right? It's not because we're racist, because we choose to be racist from day one. I mean, and we would not even accept that, because we say, oh, I have friends. I have my token Black American friend or whatever, right? But I think that fear is one of those things that we have to conquer, and that can really just be conquered by outreach to each other, right? So intercultural exchanges is very, very important as a way of conquering that fear. Alliances. I mean, alliances is very important, because we do share many of the causes. I mean, that there's always this myth that Asian Americans are better off than Hispanics and Black Americans, and while there might be a percentage of us that are like that, I do know quite a lot of working class Filipino Americans. I mean, that suffer as much racism and as much injustice as people from other races. So I think it's important to reach out as well. For you in America and other parts of the world where both symbol and substance is being dealt with, to stay out of that, diba, is for the Filipino American community and for the Filipino community to stay out of this debate and this process of change would be like cultural suicide, right? Like you're gonna leave yourself behind if you don't do that. So I think it's very important to organize around that and then to participate and make your voices heard. I mean, I too, the Philippine history part, I kind of knew that because of we had a very good history teacher. You might have taught them also, Gracie, Vince Rafael, and some of that we already looked at even then. And I did do a lot of legal history work in my work as a professor of UP Law, because that was some of the first subjects that I taught. So I saw that already. But it was only not until I actually went to the US for the first time, and I wanted to understand the Philippine American experience. I mean, other than the typical the doctors and nurses, because I had relatives who were doctors and nurses who went in the 50s. But I wanted to understand better because I was meeting second, third, fourth generation Filipinos, Filipino Americans in Yale. I met them, but also in Washington D.C. activists, etc. I wanted to understand that, and that's how I discovered also Carlos Bulosan and the experience of the first generation of migrant workers. It's important to be in touch with that, and then to have an alliance with all the different groups, so we're part of the conversation instead of, the worst thing is not to be part of the conversation, being lumped with the white, right, with the whites in that conversation, because our interests are the same when they are not the same. I would still say that that white privilege still trumps Asian, whatever Asian uniqueness we might have. That's nothing in front of white privilege.
Thank you, Tony.
That's great.
Gigi Macaraeg, you have a question? Go ahead. Gigi?
Yes, hello. Well, I have a financial services brokerage, and most of my agents are actually African Americans. I have a very, very good friend. Their leader is a woman who came from Nigeria. But the experiences that they share with me are very different from what I hear on TV. Not that they haven't experienced racism, they've had their share, pero it's not like what I hear on TV. So they're very successful, they worked hard, what they told me is that they made themselves valuable. So they're very successful in life. I don't know if Tony, oh, by the way, Tony, I know how it is to attend a Black church because I've attended their church. It's really fun. The place was literally rocking because of the dance. Even when they, give their contribution, they dance when they do that. So that was really fun for me. Anyway, I don't know if Tony can answer this or if there are lawyers in the room. Maybe you can answer this. I really want to educate myself. Do laws still exist that discriminate against Blacks or other minorities? Laws pertaining to business ownership of property, access to education, employment opportunity, access to social benefits. Do those laws still exist? The other question is, if there are police officers here, is anything in your training manual or your training programs that tell you to treat minorities differently? I want to understand talaga what's going on. That's my question. I don't know who can answer that.
Well, for the law, I can answer because I've always studied that and continue to follow that. I'm very fascinated with that. I mean, the two areas that seems clear to me that have racist laws, even if they're not expressly racist, but the effect is a racist consequence or racist consequences in voting rights. Where when you require so many things for people to vote, or for example, when you deprive, now the debate is over mailing mail-in votes. When you deprive people the right to vote, or in different ways, that eventually is racist because that targets African Americans and Latinos in a very big way, because of and by the way, that's true for the Philippines also, right? Because when you require documents, for example, the marginalized groups of people do not have documents, do not have birth certificates, do not have IDs, do not have things that can certify where they live, do not have bills. So that affects voting and suppresses voting of people, and even if it's not, say, people of color, it is racist. When you gerrymander districts to protect white seats, even in places where, it's all majority black already, but what you do is you put all the blacks in one district and all the whites in 3 other districts, and you have 3 districts that are voted on by that are representing only 20% of the population, while one black representative represent. They do that to Hispanics also. Will only represent, right? Because if not for that, it's a very different country that you're gonna have already, right? Because the population mix of the U.S. has changed very radically. The other thing, and I just saw this in TV, is economic laws, right? I mean, by requiring, even for businesses, and that's a good question you have. That's a really good thing. There are good black business people, entrepreneurs, but you should ask your friend the hoops that she had to jump through to get to where she is. Because I just saw that on TV the other day, that there was this very successful woman entrepreneur and helping other. The hoops are so many, and some of which are inherent. For example, if you're gonna require no college, no student loans, or minimal student loans, for example, to be able to start, the credit history has to be perfect, even, or very good, right? But if you come from disadvantaged families, you probably accumulated a lot of loans going through college because your parents would not probably have not been able to help you at all. So those are the two things that I can think of that are that disadvantage people in accordance with their race. I don't know if there are others. I think for policing, it seems to have to be well established in all of this debate, the extent to which communities are terrorized by militarized police, right? I mean, and I was really surprised about that, actually, the amount of money that is being put in the police versus the amount of money being put to renew communities and help poor communities.
Thank you, Tony. So there's another question here that I'm going to read. Are Filipinos even aware of their racist attitude? Many times, Filipino accuses others of racism and seemingly not aware of their own.
No, that's true. That's why you have to call them out. I mean, it's really time to call them out. And it's really amazing to me that I see that even in in mixed marriages, between Filipino and white and Filipino and black. I know families like that and friends with them, and you still see that, right? I mean, it's like, wow. But I think everyone is going through a moment of questioning right now. I mean, on what is really the case. I mean, I think there's something in videos, when you see something in video that strikes you, because in your mind those things should never happen, But I think the 3 things that we saw that had videos, right, captured in video, the jogger in Georgia, the woman in Central Park, and of course Floyd, that came within 1 month of each other, right? I think all of that collectively opened the eyes of everyone that, I mean, the jogger in Georgia, that only happens in movies, right? I mean, I thought it only happened in movies. Now I understand, why the director of Get Out, Jonathan Peele, or anyway, that movie Get Out. Now I understand where that's coming from. I mean, because of that kind of experience. I would not imagine, but the woman in you know, I mean, my honestly, my wife and I had a debate about that, because it's also true that racism emanates from fear, right? Fear of the unknown. I don't know this person, and I don't know this race, and I don't, why is he behaving like that? I don't know that, right? Um, and so a white woman in a park with a black man, one can argue, right, that she's afraid. She was really just afraid. But seeing that woman, very educated, and it's New York, and it's Central Park, right, in the day, no, that was racist. That was, you know, the card that was used is a card that has been used again and again in hundreds of years against black men, right? Either by white women or by their men. And so we have to call it for that, right? While acknowledging also that there's an element of fear in some people.
Thank you. So there's one more question I'm going to ask here. How do we combat colorism in the Philippines when skin whitening products, for instance, are so popular? Or the standard of beauty is the whiter your skin is, the more beautiful you are?
That is a $1 million question. I actually don't know, and I actually don't understand why you know, people would want to do that. But you know that the reverse is true, right? I mean, the story of Michael Jackson and others, although that might also be been physical, medical in nature, but you know, the only explanation of that is culture, right? And so that can only be fought also through cultural change. No amount of law will actually help you to change that approach.
Mhm. So it's time check. It's 7:06, and we grabbed Tony for this hour so that he could join us. But are there any more questions before we will adjourn the meeting?
And I'll have one final comment, if I may,
Uh-huh.
if there are no more questions.
Tony,
Yes.
this is Sid. So I have a comment and actually a question on what you think about this situation. So I have a 30-year career in city government with the city of Los Angeles. I'm a supervisor, a pretty high-level supervisor in my department. One of my first jobs in the city was processing a affirmative action program. And the affirmative action program was very favorable to minorities, Blacks, Hispanic. As long as you were a minority-owned firm, the program was very favorable to those entities. And there was a perception at the time that minorities did not get opportunities, and therefore there was I think it was a federal program, as a matter of fact, where government contracts required general contractors to have a certain percentage of minority-owned firms as their subcontractors. And so a lot of minority firms, they would get certified, and then they would be bidding. And sometimes some of the complaints I had from the general contractors were, well, I prefer to get this other firm, but because I'm required to have a certain minority percentage, I have to get this less qualified firm. And the work may not be the same as this other firm that I really want to work with. Now, I mean, that's the comment from general contractors who help to produce products for the government. And so I wonder what your comment is on that, because although I believe the program is intended to help minority and give opportunities to minority-owned firms, but there's still a perception that they're not getting the most for their money.
That's a legitimate comment, but my only response really to that is there's also in many cities, there's also a lot of white firms that is even worse than minority firms that get contracts for other reasons. You know, and so I my position has always been I support affirmative action, but people have to be held accountable for that action also. In other words, that they have to produce and they have to do right and they have to qualify. But to say, but I've also because I've also seen as I was also a manager in the US, I've also seen how so many, I mean, if I use the construct of color, I also see, and that's not because white is worse than black, right? I'm not saying that, but because there are more whites than blacks, there are more whites that are bad than black, or than color. That's my point. In other words, because there are, for every 1,000 applicants you might have 900 whites, right, and 100, no, so 100 colored or people of color. The quality of your there's lots of them that actually do not qualify and yet come in schools. Legacy, for example, right? Affirmative action versus legacy. In most of the big schools, including my own university, people get in with zero qualifications except that you're an
Your
alumni,
dad
right? Your dad,
or your
etc.
dad.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's what I'm saying. So your or your grandparents or whatever, or you make a contribution. So I'm actually not necessarily opposing that, right? What I'm just saying is that there are various ways that you approach these things, and where color is just really a factor. But many things I could say about unqualified minorities, I could actually say to many whites that I've also been classmates with and worked with. So, the solution to that is continue affirmative action, but do it better. And be more proactive, particularly in overcoming, what you would call entitled behavior. The problem kasi once you do any of this is there's entitled behavior, and I think entitled behavior applies not just to minorities but to white people, to people that feel they're entitled to something because of some particular factor versus meritocracy, right? But they always say China is the most meritocratic country now. My own experience of China is that's not also the case. I mean, very competitive to enter their universities, but connections do matter also, and also because if you're connected, you would have gone to the best schools at the very beginning, so that's why it's gonna be easy for you to be accepted in the university. So that cuts across, I think, everyone. I need to go actually in a couple of minutes, but so I just wanted to just say something. It's Independence Day in the Philippines. Please watch what's happening in the Philippines because we are, in very serious crisis, I think, both for COVID. And if Duterte is to be followed, we will have the longest years of lockdown even. He doesn't even want for people to go to school without a vaccine at all, right? And so all the planning of trying to do something that can go get the cool basically go back. But then it's not just the COVID, it's the it's the use of force that you can employ because of COVID, but then you use it for all the other purposes, and so today is an important thing to watch out for because people are going out to protest and celebrate. There'll be big events in UP and Ateneo, and the policemen are all now gathered around all the roads there to stop people from coming in, using COVID as the excuse. I mean, which is illegal because there is nothing in all our laws that allow them to arrest people. You can be told, but you cannot be arrested. because that's the right to people to gather together, is a constitutional right. So I just wanted to say that there are things happening also in the Philippines right now that are quite
Disturbing
important.
and disturbing.
Thank you.
So, maraming salamat, Tony. Thank you for sharing with us your knowledge and your reflections about racism, especially from a philosophical point of view. Thank you for inspiring us. We are aware that the battle is going to be a long one, but I think we have made the first step by coming together and having this open and respectful dialogue among us so that we can also reach out and stand up for against racism and also be able to talk about this with our family and with our friends and at work. So maraming salamat.
Thanks everyone. Maraming salamat din. Maulit. Thank you.
Yes. So before we close this forum, I would like to remind those who have not yet accepted their invitations to join Athenians for Social Justice, please confirm your invitation. And we encourage you to post, to make comments on the things that we have posted on the Facebook wall. If we don't share this with others, it's just like preaching to the crowd or to the choir. So we need to be able to openly share this with others also and start the conversations with the people around us. So anyone else in the group that would like to say something or to comment before Tony leaves? No more?
Yeah,
So
thank you.
maraming salamat, Tony. Bye.
Bye-bye. Mabuhay ang Pilipinas.
Padayon.